Hello, I'm Dave Crichton and I'm a brand consultant, writer, and creative director at a branding agency in Birmingham called IE. We're excited to be working with Healthwatch to help the organisation to shape its brand and to better articulate who it is, what it does, and why that's so important. Now, today, our research team has immersed ourselves in some of the work that Healthwatch has already undertaken around its brand. And we're reaching out to key stakeholders, people like you, to understand your perception of and insight into the Healthwatch brand. But before we did any of that, we did what we always do at the beginning of a project like this, and we took a good look at Healthwatch through the lens of your audiences, through the eyes of someone that isn't steeped in knowledge of your organisation or your mission or your people, because that level of objectivity is really helpful to us in the work that we'll be doing together. That overview simply involved us looking over your website and key publications, reading some of your content, looking at social media, watching some of your videos, and generally just seeing how you engage with the world and recording our observations. We shared that with the Healthwatch team that we're working with for this exercise, and they felt that it would be interesting for you to hear those observations too. Now, it's worth remembering that we deliberately did this exercise before we found out more about you, to simulate, as it were, what it's like to engage with Healthwatch for the very first time. Now, you might feel that some of our observations are eerily accurate, or you might think that we're downright wrong. But remember, this isn't about right or wrong. It was about first impressions. And if we were confused or misled, or we simply missed something, the chances are that at some point, so too did your audiences. So, what did we think? Well, we thought it was very clear from even a quick glance that you're doing really good work and that you genuinely care about improving patient health and outcomes. There's a sincerity to the brand, and I instantly believe in the cause that you are fighting for. But we didn't feel the tone was quite right. I really didn't like the way that in your brand guidelines you tell writers to constantly use modifiers. For instance, we're told that Healthwatch should be compassionate but not emotional, friendly but not informal, authoritative but not cold. And I have a couple of issues with that. Firstly, it's quite paralysing as a writer to be given advice like that. And you're likely to make your writers so paranoid about getting those kind of relationships right that they forget to concentrate on the core message. You really don't want copywriters agonising over, was that a bit too cold? Was that a bit too emotional? And you're likely to also find that the second word, the modifier, actually comes to dominate the first word. Because in truth, can you be compassionate without being emotional? Now, to me, it makes me think of a kind of paternal figure from times gone by patting you on the shoulder when you're crying and saying awkwardly, there, it'll all be okay. It robs the brand of heart, is what I would say. Now, we're believers in, when writing, to write the same way as you would speak. And I really don't think that if I was in a room with you people, that's the kind of tone I would hear coming from the Healthwatch team itself. So it shouldn't be coming from the Healthwatch brand. Now, ultimately, I thought there were at times too much writing, too much copy. It's too corporate. It lacks a clear personality, in our opinion. And while it sometimes satisfies the head, it never quite grabs the heart. I think the spectre of the CQC also looms quite large, and it's clear that many times throughout the brand you're trying to be the CQC. There's a sense of officiousness about the brand, which doesn't feel right for a brand that sees itself as a champion of the people. The CQC can just about get away with that because of its statutory role, but on a continuum between people and state, so to speak, governments, healthcare providers, I think the brand needs to swing much more towards being positioned as a people's brand, which makes you think of organisations like Which, or campaigners like the Martin Lewis's website, for instance. We also felt that the brand was just too vague about what you actually do. It's clear you've listened, and it's clear that you continue to listen, and that you're on a mission to listen to even more people. That's great. And there's clear value in listening, we understand that, especially to those that have little or no voice. But what's the point of listening? In order for the brand to go from passive to active, I think we need to see what you're doing about what you've heard. And that kind of impact assessment is in really short demand from what we could see on the Healthwatch brand at the moment. Instead, we see what are a lot of kind of empty platitudes, things like because everyone needs a voice. Yes, they do, but it's the why that makes people care. That's a problem because cynicism is always the enemy of these kind of worthy brands. And in one survey we subsequently read about Healthwatch, around 50% of people thought that it was unlikely that anyone would act on their feedback. And one of the reasons people so often don't complain or share their experiences is because, frankly, they don't think anything will happen. You need to prove them wrong. Impact has to be about actions. It has to be about results. It's not enough to say that we're adding another 0 to the number of people you've listened to. That's not impact. We're not trying to build the world's biggest talking heads compendium. We're trying to enact change. There's a little bit of what I would call true impact. For instance, structural changes to healthcare as a result of Healthwatch. But you only really see it buried in annual reports, for instance. We need to make more of that and bring it to your shop front. And remember, we're not saying that impact needs to be huge statistics or wholesale national governmental change. Sometimes it can be tiny regional changes that make a big impact. And that's really more about telling stories as well as writing or publishing stats. And we need more of those stories because hearing about change from real people makes the brand authentic and personable, and it makes people care. And that sense of passive and active language and behaviour is a core theme, I believe. Healthwatch can't just be a postbox or an intermediary, a middleman. If you're just saying you'll get me to write a letter, which I pass to you, which you in turn pass to government or a healthcare provider, then I'm left thinking, why do I need Healthwatch? Now, of course, the first hint of a differentiator is that you actually are more than a postbox. You go out to people to gauge their opinions. You don't just wait for them to come to you. But you need to work harder to demonstrate that you're different to other advocacy groups that we found. Now, part of this, I think, is also how the world itself has changed over the past decade. We're so used to campaigners like Greta Thunberg or Marcus Rashford or Martin Lewis advocating for change and campaigning on behalf of people without a voice. It's raised the bar for organisations like yours because people expect those kind of groups to make some noise and to bring some accountability from the healthcare sector. Now, obviously, this is a tricky balance because we don't want to be antagonistic. The public rightly cherish our NHS and our care workers now more than ever. But think about the difference between you writing to your MP and, if you did that, getting a stock letter back from a secretary saying that they would look into it and thanking you for their letter. Would you ever bother writing back after a response like that? Now compare that with sitting down and watching a politician getting a grilling from Andrew Marr or Paxman. That's what we call visible accountability. And again, I'm not saying we need to start grilling chief executives of care trusts, but could we lift the lid on the process? Could we show people where their email or comment goes to see, to prove that something happened rather than it disappearing into a Narnia-esque wardrobe never to be seen again? And that's one kind of accountability. But another in the 21st century, of course, are review platforms like TripAdvisor. Why are they so popular? Because it allows people to vent, which Healthwatch does, of course, as well, and to get things off their chest. But with TripAdvisor, the very act of feedback is the action because people know that their comments will immediately be made clear to both the recipient but also to other people as well. Again, not something you can really do with Healthwatch, but something to compare nonetheless. Now, we try to allude to the fact, or Healthwatch does rather, that you have some powers, and that's woven throughout your comms at times. But in truth, we recognise that that power to be listened to is actually very different from the power to be heard. And that's why I think at times Healthwatch can feel like an organisation that wants to deliver change, but it lacks any real teeth, any real bite. And we also felt at times that the relationship between Healthwatch England at a national level and the local watches was a bit confused in your comms. And I think more could be done to articulate how the model works, and frankly why it works so well. There's generally just a bit of uncertainty that I detect in your messaging, like I'm reading something written by an organisation that doesn't quite know who it is and what it wants to be. It's a bit like body language. Sometimes you can observe that somebody is uncomfortable. You don't quite know why, but it's coming through in the way that they behave, and that's true of copy too. You can see that sense of uncertainty then coming through by a tendency to obfuscate some of your copy to hope nobody notices. That's never the answer. The only way for audiences to gain clarity is for you first to gain clarity for yourselves. Could we even extend that perhaps by making sure that everyone's comment is logged in a CRM and that we'll send email updates every 3 or 6 months? So for instance, you told us about A&E waiting times, and here's where we're up to in our discussion with government about waiting times. Accountability and transparency really is everything for an organisation like yours, and it's how we combat cynicism and apathy. And what about your visual identity, the way you look? It's okay, but it's still fairly safe, fairly corporate, quite repetitive, and it fails what we call the logo test. It's where you take off your logo from a website or a document cover and say, could we just swap out the logo for the CQC's or even Public Health England's logo? Probably is the answer, and I think you could do a lot more to be visually compelling and distinctive in a crowded sector. Finally, we felt sometimes you fell into the trap of talking to everyone at the same time in the same way, rather than segmenting audiences and saying, okay, clearly the needs of a policymaker are very different to that of a patient, and mapping the different calls to action and marketing messages and user journeys that flows from that insight. All things we can and will be helping you with. So those are just a few of our initial impressions, having known next to nothing about the Healthwatch brand at the time. And there's nothing in there that can't be resolved by conversations with you and your teams. With your audiences and with branding agencies like ours, it's really about making sure that you look and sound as good as you are in the future. Now, clearly our knowledge is much richer and deeper now that we've begun the research process, but we'll always keep coming back to these first impressions because it's so critical that whatever changes we make, we always bear in mind what it's like for your audiences to discover Healthwatch for the very first time. Thank you.